Okay, so the third group that we're talking about is farmers. Like industrial workers, American farmers also tried to exert some measure of control over their lives by joining organizations designed to better their lot. There were many such groups in the late 19th century, but the two most significant, were the Grange and the Farmers Alliance. Let me talk to you about the Grange first. Uh, the Grange was founded in 1867. It began as a fraternal society for farmers, much like the Elks or the Kiwanis Club today. It stressed it was an organization designed to provide social and recreational activities for farmers, but it also stressed education about modern farming methods and other issues that were important to farmers. What changed the Grange and its function in rural America was the Panic of 1873. Panic of 1873 created huge economic discontent, especially in rural and agricultural regions of the country. After 1873, the Grange became a potent political force in the Midwest. It actually captured control of state legislatures in several Midwestern states, such as Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, and others. And once in power, these Grange legislators passed laws that were favorable to farmers, such as limiting railroad rates on grain and other farm produce. The movement didn't last, however. The Grange as a political movement did not last, because after the economic panic faded, the Grange basically died out. Uh, the next major farmers' organization to emerge was the Farmers Alliance. It got started in the late 1870s after the decline of the Grange. It began as various state and local level farmers' alliances, which eventually merged into a national farmers' alliance. You see here on the slide there's a flag. This is the flag of the Texas Farmers Alliance, which was founded in 1878, one of the first statewide alliances to be founded. And as I said, eventually these different state level alliances get together in 1887 and form the National Farmers Alliance. By 1890, this group had around 3 million members nationwide, the largest organization of its kind in the country. Like the Grange before it, the Farmers Alliance was initially not very political. It promoted social and fraternal activities. It promoted practical education for farmers, and so on. The Farmers Alliance also stressed the importance of cooperative activities for the mutual benefit of its members. Sometimes they would set up what were called co-op stores, where they could collectively sell their crops for the best possible price and also buy tools and supplies at the cheapest possible price. They did not initially see the need for political activism, but as had been the case with the Grange, what changed that was an economic crisis. In the case of the Farmers Alliance, it was the Panic of 1893. This was a severe economic recession that hit rural areas especially hard. Many farmers were pushed to the brink of bankruptcy, or in some cases even beyond it. Members of the Farmers Alliance began to see that many of their concerns could not be addressed through cooperative action alone, that they needed help from the government. Of course, the problem is that the government wasn't very receptive to their interests, to their demands. And as a result, they eventually became more political. The Farmers Alliance gradually developed a coherent reform agenda that consisted of several major legislative reforms that they wanted to see enacted. And these reforms became the basis of the Farmers Alliance agenda, and eventually they would later become the basis of the Populist Party's platform, but more on that in a bit. So what reforms did the Farmers Alliance advocate? Well, there are six major ones that I want you to be familiar with. First, they wanted federal regulation of the banking system. One of their core beliefs was a fear of unregulated money interests, which basically meant bankers, financiers, Eastern capitalists, and so on. They believed that these people victimized farmers for their own selfish benefit. And one way to stop that was by regulating the banking industry to restrict the interest that they could charge on farmers' loans and to regulate them in the interest of the common man, the average ordinary farmer. Second, they proposed a progressive income tax. Now, what is a progressive income tax? Well, that's basically the system that we have today. A progressive income tax is where different people get taxed at a different rate based on how much money you earn. So if you earn more, you're in a higher tax bracket, therefore you pay a higher percentage of your income in taxes. Members of the Farmers Alliance felt that that was a fair system and that was something that should be adopted nationwide. Third, they wanted federal regulation of the nation's railroads. Just like they wanted regulation of the banks, they also wanted regulation of the railroads. They particularly wanted limits placed on railroad rates, that is, the fees that railroads could charge for transporting their produce from place to place. They believed that the rates railroads were charging for transporting corn and wheat and grain and all the other things that the farmers produced were exorbitant. Fourth, they wanted the direct election of U.S. senators. Now, this was prior to the 17th Amendment, which actually made direct election of senators a reality. Before that point, however, U.S. senators were actually not elected by the people, but rather they were elected by the state legislatures. Each state legislature would choose a senator when the old senator's term had expired, or possibly they'd return the old senator as the incumbent. Um, Either way, it was the state legislatures who made the choice. Members of the Farmers Alliance thought that that was inherently unfair, it was undemocratic, and more to the point, it also made the U.S. Senate the tool of special interests because their members did not have to face the electorate directly. They wanted to change that. Uh, Number five, they wanted something called free silver, which basically means they wanted to monetize silver. At this time, U.S. currency was based on the gold standard. In other words, the value of a dollar was essentially regulated or pegged to the price of gold. Farmers Alliance and later the Populace wanted silver to be monetized so as to help out the little guy. By adding silver as well as gold to the money supply, they thought that the dollar would be devalued. This would help those in debt because it would create inflation. Inflation would enable poor farmers who were in debt to repay their debts with devalued money. It also meant that the farmers would be paid more for the products that they were producing. And lastly, they wanted something called the Sub-Treasury Plan. Now, what was the Sub-Treasury Plan? Well, the gist of it was this. The idea behind the Sub-Treasury Plan was that the U.S. government would establish federal warehouses in every rural county in the country. In these warehouses, the farmers could store their crops in exchange for a low-interest federal loan equal to about 80% of the market value of the crops that they deposited. The crops would basically serve as the collateral for these loans. The farmers could then take the money that they got from the government and use it to pay their expenses. And in the meantime, they could wait until the price for the crop that they had produced went up to a level that they felt was reasonable or felt was most to their advantage, and then they could sell their crops at the most opportune time. They wouldn't have to sell their crops immediately. Uh, this was designed, this system, the sub-treasury plan, it was designed to give farmers a way to exert some type of control over the fluctuations in agricultural commodity prices so that they would not be the victims of random fluctuations in the market for these goods. So that's the Farmers Alliance agenda, these six major things that they wanted. There were other things that they wanted as well, but these were the major elements of their program that they advocated. Now, at first, the members of the Farmers Alliance tried to pursue these reforms by working within the traditional two-party system. You'd have alliance men who were Democrats, alliance men who were Republicans, and so on. But eventually, they realized that neither the Republicans nor the Democrats were especially receptive to their ideas. And eventually, they decided that in order to enact their reforms, they would have to create a brand new political party. And this party became known as the People's Party, or more commonly today, it is referred to as the Populist Party. So, the Populist Party emerged in the early 1890s. It was the first major third-party movement in American politics since the Republican Party had been created back in the 1850s. There are three major characteristics of the Populist Party that you need to be familiar with. First, at its heart, the Populist Party was an insurgent opposition party. In other words, its essence, its major purpose, was to be an alternative to the two traditional parties that both appeared to be supporting the status quo. Both of them appeared to be in support of big business and banks and railroads at the expense of the common man. Second, the Populist Party was a progressive party. It placed emphasis on using the government to address the needs of the poor and the powerless, especially farmers. At the same time, although they were a progressive party, their activism was limited. They were mainly concerned with things that affected farmers. They didn't endorse women's suffrage or temperance, for example, even though a lot of their members supported those things. Their primary focus was, again, on issues important to farmers. The third characteristic of the Populist Party has to do with their constituency, the people that they recruited into their membership. The heart and soul of the Populist Party was poor and middle-class farmers in the South and the Midwest, as well as a few Western miners, silver miners particularly, in places like Nevada, really liked the Populist Party because it supported free silver, and for them that meant more jobs and better wages. But for the most part, the Populist Party recruited farmers, not industrial workers. Moreover, in the South, some members of the Populist Party actually tried to integrate poor black farmers into their constituency, but ultimately without much success. So, what's the agenda of the Populist Party? Well, the agenda of the Populist Party was basically the same as the agenda of the old Farmers Alliance. All of those six major reforms that the Farmers Alliance pushed, the Populist Party pretty much pushed for those things as well. Federal regulation of the banking system, a progressive income tax, federal regulation of the railroads, direct election of senators by the people, free silver, and the sub-treasury plan. To these proposals, however, the Populists added a few new items of their own. For example, they proposed a national 8-hour workday. They wanted Congress to limit the workday to 8 hours for all working people. This was done primarily to try and recruit some union members into their ranks, but they didn't have much success in that direction. They also wanted government nationalization of the railroads. In other words, they wanted the government to take over the railroads and run them for the benefit of the people. But otherwise, their agenda was pretty much the same as the Farmers Alliance had been. However, and you need to understand this as probably more than anything else, by far the most important part of the populist platform was free silver. Although all of the other issues that I've alluded to were important to them, the issue that they cared most about was free silver. Uh, they chose to emphasize it because it most clearly set them apart from the other two major parties. And as a result, it became sort of the touchstone of populist politics by the mid 1890s. Now, in its early days, the Populist Party actually experienced a good bit of electoral success. At first, it seemed like the populist message resonated with a lot of voters, especially in rural areas, not surprisingly. The attractiveness of this message was seen by some of the early victories they enjoyed at the polls. For example, in the election of 1892, the populists fielded their first ever presidential candidate, a fellow by the name of James Weaver. Now, Weaver didn't really have any chance to win, but in terms of vote getting, he actually ended up doing fairly well. He turned in a respectable performance. He won about 1 million votes, or about 9% of all the votes cast in that election. Then 2 years later, in the congressional midterm elections of 1892, spurred on by the economic suffering created by the Panic of 1893, the populists did even better. In 1894, they elected 9 members of the House of Representatives. They also did very well, not just in Congress, but they did very well in the various state level elections, especially in the South. In the South, the populists often joined with the Republicans in supporting what were called fusion tickets against the incumbent Democrats. In North Carolina, for example, a Republican populist fusion ticket won control of the state legislature, which later chose 2 fusionist U.S. senators. And they also won most statewide offices there. So, heading into the 1896 presidential election, the populists looked to be in pretty good shape. They were not the majority party, but they were winning elections. They were gaining supporters. It looked like they had momentum on their side. And yet we know within a few years the Populist Party would have completely collapsed. So what happened? Well, what happened is they badly managed to screw up the election of 1896. Heading into the presidential election of 1896, the Democratic Party nominated a young former congressman from Nebraska, William Jennings Bryan. This is Bryan right here. They nominate William Jennings Bryan as their presidential candidate. The Republicans, by contrast, nominated a quiet, reserved, very taciturn governor of Ohio, a fellow by the name of William McKinley. This is McKinley over here. McKinley was very much a conservative politician in the mold of previous Republican presidents. He wholeheartedly approved of the traditional pro-business and pro-industry philosophy that had governed prior administrations. He was a strong supporter of the gold standard, for example. Not surprisingly, he also followed the traditional approach to campaigning, which was that a presidential candidate should try to stay out of sight, that he should let surrogates, spokesmen who acted on his behalf, do the campaigning for him. Believe it or not, once upon a time it was actually considered to be fairly undignified for a presidential candidate to go out and beat the bushes and give stump speeches and ride the trains and ask people for their votes. That was considered to be beneath the office of the presidency. And McKinley adhered to the traditional mode of campaigning that most other presidents had used. Bryan, however, was very much a new type of candidate. He went around the country giving big speeches holding big rallies, asking people for their votes, much like contemporary politicians do today. Bryan also believed, and this is important, Bryan also believed that the key to Democratic victory that year would be an alliance with the populists. And fortunately, Bryan happened to agree with the populists on one major issue, and that is he was a strong advocate of free silver. Now, he didn't agree with them on a whole lot else, but he agreed with them on free silver, that the federal government should use silver as well as gold as the basis of its money supply. At the Democratic National Convention that year, Bryan delivered a blistering speech about the gold standard, attacking the gold standard. The speech was known as the Cross of Gold speech. It's called that because at one point in the speech he actually went as far as to compare the gold standard to the crucifixion of Christ. I'll read you the passage. He says, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Now, that is about as extreme as it gets, comparing a monetary policy to the crucifixion of our Lord. But that's the way a lot of people, particularly a lot of populists, felt about it. Bryan's speech and the position that he took on free silver in general, it absolutely electrified not only the Democrats, but it also impressed many populists with the sincerity of his position on the free silver issue, with the result that a couple months later, the populists held their party convention, and they gave their nomination for the presidency to Bryan. So the populists and the Democrats have both endorsed Bryan for president. The populists had two main reasons for supporting Bryan. One, as I alluded to before, he agreed with them on free silver. But more than that, the populists also realized that they were still very much a minority party representing small farmers and agricultural laborers. And they wanted to have a seat at the table. They realized that they probably didn't have enough votes to win the presidential election themselves, but maybe they could help somebody else win. And if they helped Bryan win, they believed that would mean he would incorporate them into his administration. They would get a seat at the table in the Bryan administration. They would have influence over national policy. And they dearly wanted that. Nonetheless, the nomination of Bryan created certain problems for the populists. Two problems in particular. One problem was that the nomination of Bryan for president meant that the populist candidate for president and the populist candidate for vice president would technically be running on two separate tickets. At their convention, the populists nominated their own vice presidential candidate, Tom Watson of Georgia. So in effect, the populist nominees for president and vice president were now running on opposing tickets, which was very confusing for rank and file party members. Moreover, and this is probably more significant, the endorsement of Bryan for president by the populists, it created a huge identity crisis for the populists. Remember, when I talked about the major characteristics of the populists, one of their major characteristics was that they were an insurgent party. They had built themselves on being the alternative to the status quo. They justified their existence because they weren't the Republicans or the Democrats. And now they had in effect joined with one of the major parties in attempting to elect a president. To a lot of rank and file populists, that just didn't make very much sense. And there was a lot of dissent within the Populist Party over this decision. Basically, in order for things to pay off for the populists, they needed to win this election. And in the long run, we know, of course, it didn't pay off because they didn't win. In a nutshell, the results of the 1896 election for president was that McKinley won. He won the popular vote by a narrow margin, about 4 points, 51% to 47%. He won the Electoral College by a much larger margin of 271 votes to 176. He didn't win solely on his own merits, however. He had a lot of help in winning this election. The most important figure in McKinley's election campaign was the Republican political operative extraordinaire Marcus Hanna. Hanna was a brilliant politician and also an excellent campaign manager. He wasn't so much a great candidate himself in terms of selling himself to the voters, but he knew how to organize a campaign, and even more important, he knew how to fundraise. He was kind of like the Karl Rove or the David Plouffe of his generation in that respect. He raised the then unprecedented sum of $3.5 million for McKinley's presidential campaign. The McKinley-Hanna strategy focused heavily on dominating the industrial heartland of the country, on dominating all of the areas, and you can see it on this electoral map here. McKinley does very well in the upper Midwest and in the Northeast. These are states that had large populations, lots of big cities, and lots of industry, and also because they were very populous, they had lots of electoral votes. So even though Bryan swept the whole South and most of the plain states, he still wasn't able to get enough electoral votes to win. Basically, this map that I'm showing you, the electoral map of 1896, it revealed both the extent and also the limitations of the populist message. The populist emphasis on farmers' interests appealed very strongly to people in rural and agricultural regions of the country, but it didn't have nearly as much appeal in the industrialized areas, in the urban areas. And by 1896, these sections had grown so much that they had become the political center of gravity in the country. They now, in effect, controlled the destiny of the United States. So, with that in mind, I'd like to leave you with a few observations about the major consequences of the 1896 presidential election. There are four major, the 1896 presidential election meant basically four major things for the future of the country. First, it marked the triumph of a new urban industrialized society. It proved that that society was not going away, and as I mentioned before, it now controlled the destiny of the nation. Number two, second major consequence of this election is that it marked the end of the Populist Party. In 1896, the Populists had essentially bet everything on their alliance with the Democrats, getting behind Bryan for president. And when that didn't work out, their members became demoralized. There was bitter infighting and finger pointing and blame throwing, and the Populist Party, within a few years, collapsed. Third, the 1896 election also marked a huge triumph for the Republican Party, and it would be a lasting triumph. From 1896 through 1928, the Republicans won 7 out of 9 presidential elections. Moreover, during this same period, they usually controlled both houses of Congress, meaning that the Republicans had a near monopoly on political power for most of the next 3 decades. Fourth, and finally, the 1896 outcome meant that despite the economic turmoil in the country following the Panic of 1893, the voters had chosen to stay the course on the economy. It showed that they were going to continue, the American people were going to continue to let their economy develop pretty much as it had been over the preceding generation. They had made this choice because despite all of the inequities and all of the problems that industrial capitalism had created for ordinary Americans, most Americans were still basically satisfied with their lot in life, and they were optimistic that their future would be better than their past. That's it.